let's take a closer look at this morning's front pages now. And joining us this morning to review the papers, author Nikki Hodgson, editor of Spiked, Tom Slater. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for joining us. Apologies for the hoarse voice. I can assure you I've not been overdoing it. It's just the after effects of a cold. I wish there had been some fun before the voice disappeared to blame it on. Nikki, to you first of all, you've suggested the Mail, and this is about the tax burden on families. It suggests it could be the highest tax burden since the war. It's going to be a bad year ahead, isn't it, for a lot of people?
It is. I mean, that's the headline, but what the story is actually talking about is the amount of personal debt that most families are dealing with at this time. It's risen to £16,200, the average unsecured debt per household, which is £1,000 up on last year. And it's not from wanton spending, it's not even from Christmas spending. This is from people struggling to buy the basics, using credit to buy the basics. It's really, really frightening because, as we all know, there are tax hikes coming in April. Where on earth are people going to find the money if they're already this much in debt to pay those hikes?
And Tom, the government has obviously brought in quite a lot of things that they say will help people, including help with energy bills. But do you think any of this will be enough?
Well, I think that was always the problem. As eye-watering as the energy support scheme was and is in terms of helping keep people's heads above water, the pressures go far beyond that. And it's always worth remembering that even when it came to that kind of first hike in energy bills, that was something which really pushed a lot of people who were already very exposed kind of over the breadline, if you like. So that's always one of the problems that the government was always facing, was that given how kind of deep the hole was, as it were, there were going to be so many people who were going to be drastically affected, no matter how ambitious, no matter how drastic their plans were. So yeah, really grim reading, looking forward to the next year for many people out there, unfortunately.
And Tom, on the front of the Mail and on the front of most of the other papers, images of Pelé. The king of football is the Sun's front page. Was he the greatest of all time, do you think?
Well, it's so difficult to make that determination, isn't it? I mean, you could easily say he was the greatest of his particular generation, but comparing like for like across the years is always a bit of a mug's game. But I think what you've seen across the newspapers as well is how, beyond the stats, beyond the record of 3 World Cup wins, the 1,200 goals and so on, just how important he was as well as a kind of world cultural figure, that he was almost unlike any other kind of renowned historic football player, a kind of global cultural icon. I mean, even Andy Warhol famously said once that he was wrong about his 15 minutes of fame when it came to Pelé, because he would be famous for 15 centuries. I think if that's one thing that marks him out from the Maradonas or the others who are still incredible icons in their own right, it's just that level of kind of global cultural superstardom, which seems to be all his own in that respect.
Nikki, as well as being an amazing footballer, seemed to be such a nice character and had so many good close friendships with people in the industry, didn't he?
Yeah, lots of people coming forward with really lovely stories and happy memories of interactions with him. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously very sad, but very lovely that he's been remembered in such a positive way.
Nikki, you've also suggested a story on the front of the Eye, and this is about the number of police recruits that were brought in under Boris Johnson. A huge number in the beer to have quit. How many have quit, and what do we know about why?
Yeah, so Boris Johnson, if you remember, pledged that he was going to tackle lots of social problems by hiring 20,000 new police officers. And by March 2023, that was the pledge. But already 1,800 are known to have resigned, and possibly more, because this is only a survey of some of the forces that have come forward with the numbers. This was a policy that came from the 2019 Tory manifesto, and it was intended to reverse the impact of austerity, basically. But yeah, they're struggling, and what's kind of more damning, I suppose, is they don't necessarily know why that these recruits have quit. It's not obviously clear from the outset why.
Tom, what do you think about the numbers going? I mean, do you think there is an obvious reason why people are leaving?
Well, I think it's not entirely clear. I think it's always difficult to kind of come down one side or the other, but I think it's impossible to deny the scale of the problem at this point, which I don't think anyone serious could possibly do, really.
On to COVID, and the Times, Tom, are pointing out that ministers are resisting pressure from lots of other countries to test people coming in from China for COVID, since China has released its regulations on travel. Do you think it's inevitable that we will have more testing for people coming from China?
I'm not sure if it's inevitable. I mean, it does seem like the scientific advice at the moment that the government is receiving is to suggest that it's ultimately somewhat pointless given how many people are already infected in the country, given how many people have immunity and so on. I understand that there is a concern about a new variant appearing, given that there are going to be so many people in China that the virus will be passing through, which it hasn't passed through before, and so on. But at the same time, I understand that when it comes to kind of COVID-19 curbs, probably testing and any restrictions on people coming into the country, probably amongst the least controversial. But it does worry me when you see people like Steve Bryan talking about the fact that we should err on the side of overreaction. Given the fact that over the course of the past few years, I think a lot of bad things were done in the spirit of overreaction, we should be a little bit cautious, but it does seem like at this point the government is sticking to the scientific advice, which is to hold firm on not introducing those new restrictions.
And the Telegraph has that story as well. Nikki, you were nodding along there, but would you welcome more tests from those coming from China?
Well, it's difficult to know. I mean, Rishi Sunak is quite clear that he is considering, nothing's off the table, he's considering it, but that he's not keen to do it because of the social impact of any kind of restrictions. I think, any kind of reintroduction of anything that was touted as a COVID restriction would sort of inflame the nation at this stage. But the problem is we don't know how honest China is being about the numbers and the severity of the cases, and that's why it's being considered.
And then I suppose the point that Tom is also that testing people at least gives us information about the kind of variants that they may or may not have, which will give us information about the possible immunisation levels in the UK and whether or not they could counter it.
No, I do completely understand that. I think there's one thing that I think we can all take, which is sort of non-controversial, is being able to keep on top of infectious disease full stop, being able to monitor things. That's, I think, something that everyone can agree on. I think what concerns me is when that becomes a kind of knock-on argument for we must introduce that restriction, whatever. This, as I say, is less controversial when it comes to people coming into the country rather than people being able to move within this country itself. But at the same time, I think, yes, acting in the spirit of caution when introducing restrictions is probably a good idea, given the fact that we had so many just kind of steamroll it out over the course of the past.
Okay. Tom and Nikki, thanks a lot for bringing us through your choices. We'll speak to you again in the next hour. Thanks both very much. Still to come on Sky News Breakfast, we'll have more from the world of football as it mourns the loss of one of the greatest players of all time, Pelé.